The morning of my daughter's wedding, I stood alone in the bathroom of a lakeside hotel and stared at my reflection while trying not to fall apart before the ceremony even started. I remember gripping the marble counter so tightly my fingers hurt as I whispered to myself that I could cry later, just not yet. Not before I finally spoke the truth I had carried inside me for more than 2 decades. At 63 years old, I had learned how to survive grief, exhaustion, loneliness, and disappointment, but that morning felt different. That morning felt like standing on the edge of something that could either destroy my family or finally free me from the weight I had dragged behind me for 22 years. My hair was silver now and cut short because it had never grown back the same after chemotherapy. The lines around my eyes had settled permanently years ago, and I had stopped wasting money on creams and makeup trying to erase them. My daughter had chosen my dress herself. A soft powder blue gown that fit comfortably and made me look, according to her, like the kind grandmother children immediately trusted. She had smiled when she said it, and I held on to that memory while I reached into my purse and touched the folded white card hidden inside. I had carried that card with me for 11 months. Some days it felt heavier than bricks. I grew up in northern Ontario, in a mining town where the winters were brutal, and the men came home from work covered in the smell of metal and grease, no matter how hard they scrubbed their hands. My father worked underground his entire life, and when I was little, I thought every man in the world probably did the same thing. I left home at 19 to study nursing because I wanted a different future, something steady and meaningful. That was where I met my husband, Daniel. He was an electrician with warm brown eyes and the kind of laugh that made strangers smile in return. We married young, moved to a small town outside Thunder Bay, and for a while I truly believed life had settled into something safe. Then Daniel died in a fire when our daughter was only 3 years old. Even now, writing those words feels unreal. The fire happened at a construction site during a warehouse conversion project. The official investigation found that multiple safety inspections had been skipped and records had been falsified. A subcontractor had signed off on electrical work that had never actually been inspected. That subcontractor was a developer named Victor Langley. I have never forgotten his name. I wrote it down over and over in an old notebook during the first year after Daniel died because I was terrified my anger would fade before justice ever came. But it never faded. It settled into my bones instead. Nothing happened to Victor. He hired lawyers, he had connections. There were meetings and paperwork and promises, and in the end I was handed a settlement barely large enough to keep food on the table. $38,000 in exchange for silence. I signed the papers because my refrigerator was nearly empty, and my daughter needed winter boots. I remember sitting at my kitchen table afterward feeling like I had sold something sacred just to survive another month. I hated myself for it, but survival leaves very little room for pride. I moved back to Sudbury with my daughter Emily and rebuilt our lives from scratch. I worked double shifts at the hospital. I slept whenever I could. I attended school concerts half awake after 12-hour nights. I packed lunches, paid bills, fixed broken faucets, and learned how to be both parents at once. Emily grew into the exact opposite of me. She was fearless and outgoing and somehow managed to become the kind of person who could make friends in a grocery store line. She inherited her father's kindness and my stubbornness, and when she became a civil engineer, I cried harder at her graduation than I had at my own wedding. 3 years ago, she called me one Tuesday evening and told me she had met someone. I could hear excitement in her voice immediately. She said his name was Ethan, that he worked in commercial development in Toronto, and that they had met during a conference in Vancouver. According to her, they sat at a hotel bar talking for almost 5 hours without noticing the time passing. She told me she knew almost immediately that he was different from anyone else she had dated before. When she brought him home for the first time, I liked him within minutes. He was thoughtful without trying too hard. He carried dishes into the kitchen after dinner without being asked and listened carefully whenever Emily spoke. There was a steadiness about him that reminded me painfully of Daniel. He mentioned his family only briefly, saying his father worked in development and construction and that their relationship was complicated. I did not ask questions because by that age I had learned every family carried scars somewhere beneath the surface. Everything changed the night I attended their engagement party. The party was held at Ethan's parents' house in Oakville, a massive home in one of those neighborhoods where every driveway looks like a luxury car dealership. I arrived carrying a bottle of wine and a wrapped gift, nervous in the ordinary way mothers are when meeting future in-laws. Then the front door opened, and standing there smiling at me was Victor Langley. For a second, the entire world seemed to stop moving. He had aged, of course. His hair was mostly white now, and his face carried the softness of old age, but I recognized him instantly from newspaper photos and archived business articles I had obsessed over years earlier. He did not recognize me. Why would he? To him, I had been nothing more than a grieving widow attached to paperwork he buried decades ago. I somehow survived that evening without collapsing. I watched him laugh with guests, refill wine glasses, and tell stories while my daughter stood beside Ethan, glowing with happiness. I watched this man move comfortably through the world after destroying mine. On the drive home, I kept both hands locked on the steering wheel and drove 4 straight hours in complete silence. I never told Emily what I discovered. People may judge me for that, and maybe they should. But I knew my daughter. I knew that if I told her immediately, she would feel trapped between loyalty to me and love for Ethan. I had spent 30 years raising her with everything I had inside me, and I could not bear the thought of turning my grief into a weapon that forced her to choose sides. So instead, I made another choice. I hired a lawyer. For nearly a year, I quietly reopened every wound I had spent decades trying to survive. We dug through records, legal filings, inspection reports, and corporate histories. What we uncovered was worse than I imagined. Victor had been connected to multiple safety violations over the years, including another development project where inspections were approved fraudulently. Families had lost homes because buildings became unsafe. Complaints existed. Patterns existed. Most importantly, the non-disclosure agreement I signed all those years ago did not prevent me from cooperating with regulatory investigations. For the first time in 22 years, I had a path forward. By summer, formal complaints had been filed with provincial regulators. Investigations were active. My lawyer handed me a small white summary card listing the complaint numbers and investigator names. That was the card sitting in my purse the morning of the wedding. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Emily looked radiant walking down the aisle, and for a few precious hours I almost convinced myself I could keep the truth buried a little longer. But during the reception, Victor stood to make a speech, and everything changed. He spoke confidently like a man used to commanding attention. He praised Ethan, talked about business success, told expensive vacation stories nobody cared about, and then finally mentioned my daughter. Smiling into the microphone, he said it was wonderful that Emily had risen above her modest upbringing and found a better life for herself through their family. The room went still around me. I looked across the reception hall and saw Emily face freeze in humiliation. I saw Ethan stare at his father with disbelief. And suddenly every year of silence inside me cracked open at once. I stood up slowly with my water glass in my hand and asked if I could say something. At first, only a few people noticed, but gradually the conversations faded and the room quieted. I could hear my own heartbeat as I looked directly at Victor Langley for the first time in 22 years. I told everyone my husband died at a construction site when my daughter was 3 years old. I explained that the safety inspection had been falsified by the very same man currently standing at the microphone pretending to celebrate family values. I said there was now an active investigation into his business practices and that my daughter deserved to know exactly who was sitting at her wedding table. The silence afterward felt endless. Then, Ethan stood up and told his father to step outside immediately. Everything after that became messy and emotional. Guests whispered. Some relatives left. Ethan argued with his father for nearly an hour somewhere down the hallway, while I sat alone on the dock behind the venue with my shoes off, staring at the lake while the sunset turned the sky orange and pink. Eventually, Emily found me. She sat beside me quietly for a long time before asking how long I had known the truth. When I admitted I had discovered it at the engagement party, tears filled her eyes. I apologized for keeping it from her, explaining that I never wanted her marriage to begin with an ultimatum. I told her I wanted her to love freely without feeling forced to sacrifice one relationship for another. Then, she looked at me and said something I will carry in my heart for the rest of my life. She said she would have chosen me. We both cried after that. Then, somehow, a duck wandered ridiculously close to the dock, completely unaware of the emotional devastation unfolding nearby. And we both started laughing through our tears because life has a strange habit of remaining ordinary even during its most painful moments. A little later, Ethan joined us. He apologized for what his father had done and admitted he had known for years that his father was unethical in business, though he never understood the full extent of it. He promised to cooperate fully with the investigation and make sure the truth came out. I believed him because he looked directly at me when he said it without flinching or looking away. The investigation is still ongoing now. It may take years. Maybe nothing substantial will happen in the end. But that no longer feels like the most important part to me. What matters is that the truth exists publicly now. There is finally an official record connecting my husband's death to the man responsible. There are files with my name attached. Statements. Complaints. Evidence. Silence protected Victor for 22 years, and the moment I finally spoke, that silence lost its power forever. A few months after the wedding, Emily called to tell me she was pregnant. I sat down at my kitchen table so suddenly I nearly knocked over my tea. She laughed and asked if I was okay, and I remember staring out the window at the birch trees in my backyard while trying not to cry again. After we hung up, I walked outside into the cold autumn air wearing nothing but socks and stood there looking at the nearly bare branches swaying in the wind. A few stubborn yellow leaves still clung to the trees long after they should have fallen. And somehow that felt exactly right. Because that is what survival really looks like. Not dramatic revenge, not perfect justice, just enduring long enough to finally speak the truth out loud after years of carrying it alone.